Today, we are going to be talking about 7 things that make you more insulin sensitive. So, when I talk about being insulin sensitive, it's basically interchangeable with reducing insulin resistance or reversing insulin resistance. Because if you're reversing insulin resistance, you are becoming more insulin sensitive. So, you can think about it either way. So, I want to run through 7 things. And of course, these aren't the only things that are going to make you insulin sensitive, but they are some of the major lifestyle changes, lifestyle additions that you can add in order to become more insulin sensitive and fight insulin resistance. So, the first thing being lowering inflammation. This is a loaded topic. I could do probably several podcasts, recordings, lessons on this issue alone, but insulin resistance drives inflammation. If you have insulin in your insulin resistance and high levels of insulin resistance, you're far along on the insulin resistance spectrum, you have a lot of inflammation. So let's just talk about some of the major things that can cause higher inflammation. Number 1 being food sensitivities. So food sensitivities can be really challenging to identify and challenging to overcome as well. So again, this could be a whole podcast, but some of the major sensitivities that people seem to develop inflammation from would be gluten, because it's a big protein. It's not the same protein as our ancestors were used to ingesting in their grains 100 plus years ago. And it's been shown in many clinical studies shown to cause micro tears in the gut lining. So I tell all my students, you're better off without it. Even if you don't have celiac disease per se, most people have some sort of gluten sensitivity, including myself. I feel way better. I have been gluten-free for almost 7 years now, unless I've been accidentally exposed to it. But I feel so much better without it. And most of the foods that contain gluten are processed foods that you want to stay away from. Anyway, so that's a big one. Seed oils are very, very inflammatory. So again, could do a whole podcast on this, but seed oils such as canola, corn, safflower, sunflower, soybean, rice bran, I'm forgetting a couple of them, but those are the seed oils, the major seed oils that cause inflammation in the body. So removing those can be very beneficial. There are lots of things. Soybean, another one, in any form, a lot of grains, nightshades, oxalates. A lot of people have sensitivities to certain foods. So again, it can be challenging to identify these. I know myself, I'm very sensitive to gluten. I'm sensitive to corn, unless I do okay with organic corn that's non-GMO. And oats are another thing that just for my personal body cause me bloating and inflammation. I can feel it in my body. I can like see it on my face if I ingest these foods over the course of several days. So anyway, that is food sensitivities for me, but writing things down and identifying any symptoms can be helpful, at least for a couple of weeks. And sometimes your symptoms may not show up until 3 days after you've ingested a food. So for instance, you might get a headache a couple of days after you've been exposed to a food you're sensitive to, or you get bloated the next day. Those are just a couple of examples. Or you get inflammation in your skin, you break out, you have acne. That can be, a day to 3 days after you've ingested a food. So that's a big one. So try to pinpoint any food sensitivities that might be harmful in your body. Hormones being another big source of inflammation. I've talked about insulin. When insulin levels are too high and you have insulin resistance, that causes inflammation. And of course, high levels of cortisol. When you've been under chronic stress day after day, you've had lots of stressful events, in your life, that's another indication of high inflammation, and just asking those adrenal issues to constantly pump out cortisol can cause issues as well. So those can be major signs of inflammation. Not having healthy detoxification. So if your gallbladder is not working well, if your liver is not working well, all of those things can drive up inflammation. Environmental toxins can drive up inflammation, lots and lots of things. Another thing that you want to be aware of is if your vitamin D level is very low, you can supplement with vitamin D3K2, and that helps to lower inflammation in the body, because low vitamin D is just, again, vitamin D is needed for so many things: good sleep, detoxification, even digestion. It's helpful for that. It almost behaves more like a hormone than it does a vitamin. So making sure that you have adequate levels of vitamin D and supplementing with vitamin D3K2 can be helpful. So those are some of the primary drivers of inflammation. So that being the number one thing to make you more insulin sensitive is just reducing inflammation in the body. The second thing, of course, would be that helps you become more insulin sensitive is fasting and intermittent fasting, because you are lowering inflammation in the body. So that allows you to become more insulin sensitive and start to reverse that insulin resistance issue. If you're not eating, you're not producing insulin. So especially if you're not eating a high carbohydrate diet. So fasting is the most potent way to lower insulin in your body, and that's going to help you become insulin sensitive, more insulin sensitive. So I always say at least 12 hours of gut rest is your bare minimum that you want to be fasting every day. Children, there's no reason for children to eat more than 12 hours out of the day either. Just that amount of gut rest, I think, is critical from day to day to be healthy and give your digestive tract a rest. And then for becoming more insulin sensitive, I would say like a minimum of 16 hours of fasting most days is going to help you to start reversing that insulin resistance issue and becoming more insulin sensitive. And really, it's like hour 20 for most people that insulin really starts to fall, hour 20 of fasting. So if you're just doing 16 to 18 hours every single day, you can still have issues with high insulin. And getting into that therapeutic range, I've done lots of podcasts and lessons over the therapeutic range of fasting, but that 36 to 42 hour range a couple of times a week can really move the needle and help you become more insulin sensitive. It's not forever. It's while you're reversing the disease process, but those therapeutic fasts can be super helpful to help reverse insulin resistance and become more insulin sensitive. So becoming more insulin sensitive just means that you're utilizing insulin well. You're able to burn energy in your body well, the energy that comes in, especially carbohydrates. Insulin is able to push the energy into the cell and let it become energy. When you're not insulin sensitive, you have issues utilizing carbohydrate, utilizing energy, and just too high levels of insulin in the body. Okay, so number 3 to help you become more insulin sensitive would be resistance training, strength training. I've talked a lot about this as well, but having or doing strength training a couple of times a week, 2 to 3 times a week as a goal, is really going to help you with insulin sensitivity. The reason being, you're depleting the glycogen stores. You're using that carbohydrate stores, you're building muscle. Muscle stores carbohydrate. Muscles and the liver store carbohydrate. So if you can preserve the muscle mass that you have and even increase it, that's just going to make you more insulin sensitive, because that's going to give you more storage area in your body for carbohydrates. So it helps to deplete glycogen, and in particular, doing resistance exercise to fatigue while you're doing resistance training, while you're doing your strength training, that's going to help promote human growth hormone. So that growth hormone is going to help you preserve the muscle and do muscle building. And that happens in a fasted state. So coupling that intermittent fasting with resistance and strength training can be super beneficial. And then not overtraining. This is really important. And I'm speaking to you women in your 40s and 50s and 60s and even in your 30s, I shouldn't generalize, but I know a lot of women who are just doing the high intensity interval training 5 times a week and wondering why they're not seeing results. Well, that HIIT training is burning calories, but it's not so much burning fat. You're not burning fat. You're not preserving and building the muscle mass. It's more of a calorie burn. So going over to strength training and not overdoing it, because once you're overtaxing your body to the point of stress, that is increasing cortisol in your body. You don't want to get to that point. You want to train hard and you want to, feel like you're working those muscles, but you don't want to overextend yourself to the point where your body's going to increase cortisol. Because we just talked about how cortisol can increase inflammation, and then you're in this vicious circle of inflammation and insulin resistance, and just not feeling well over time, and not being able to lose weight. So third thing would be insulin or resistance training. Fourth thing would be to make sure you're getting enough sleep. We've talked about this all the time on the podcast, but getting enough sleep will help you to keep your cortisol levels lower. When you get even one crappy night's sleep, like 5 hours or less, or it's not quality rest, you will increase your cortisol levels. It's by like 70% the next day, the entire next day. And you become less insulin sensitive for the entire next day. So you're more insulin resistant after just one night of poor sleep. So keep that in mind. So if you're somebody who chronically gets really poor sleep day after day, night after night, you're 5 hours or less, 6 hours or less, you're not having quality sleep where you're getting deep sleep and REM sleep, that increases your cortisol the next day and you become more insulin resistant. So people who have sleep issues tend to have blood sugar issues because of the cortisol issues. So again, it's just this vicious cycle. You have to get your sleep dialed in. And, I like to say I sleep probably 7 to 8 hours most night. And if I sleep more than 8 hours, that's almost too much for me, but I wear an Oura ring that helps me to track my sleep. I go to sleep by like 9:30, 10 o'clock. I'm just one of those people. I'm up by between 5 and 6 most days. And that's okay. For me, like I've learned, I don't care what other people think about my early bedtime. I know if I stay up past a certain point, I will get the second one that everybody talks about. And then I have a really hard time falling asleep because my cortisol has gone wonky at that point. My melatonin is off. And I just feel great if I go to sleep somewhere between 9 and 10, and that works for me. But you have to get your sleep dialed in. And I know women in perimenopause, menopausal years, sleep can be hard to come by sometimes, or staying asleep can be hard to come by. So you may need to, dive deeper into your sleep issues, especially if your hormones are starting to fluctuate. Maybe you need some extra progesterone to help you stay asleep. Your cortisol might be really, high at night where it's supposed to be high in the morning and starting to come down at night. So melatonin can rise. So adrenal and cortisol issues can also be problematic for sleep, but you need to identify what is getting in the way of your good sleep. Sometimes it's just as easy as removing screens a couple of hours before you go to bed, and wearing blue blocking glasses at night. So you're not letting that, harsh light from the blue light from the screens into your eyes to wake you up. It could be that. It could be just establishing a better bedtime routine. It could be just going to bed earlier. Some people just stay up too late, past the time where melatonin is really peaking for them, and then they have a hard time falling asleep. or you're eating too much late at night, and that digestive process can get in the way of good quality deep sleep as well. So look at your sleep, because that's critical with being insulin sensitive. The fifth thing would be to keep glucose levels in check over the course of the day. How do we do that? We do that with intermittent fasting and not eating too often throughout the day. I myself only have 2 eating events pretty much every day. I do not snack or drink anything with calories in between my meals. I just eat 2 balanced meals where I really strive to hit my protein target. But keeping glucose low over the course of the day, keeping your carbohydrates under a certain level. Remember, carbohydrates are not evil. It's more the type of carbohydrates and how many you're taking in. If we're eating a lot of sugary, processed convenience foods that are driving our insulin levels high throughout the day, and I'm talking about sugary, breads, pastas, corn chips, donuts, pastries, tortillas, muffins, pancakes, waffles. All of those things are going to drive blood sugar up, which is going to create a big insulin response. And then it's very challenging to keep insulin low throughout the day, especially if you're doing that chronically throughout the day. So even if you're intermittent fasting 16 to 18 hours, but then you're eating a ton of carbohydrates and you're eating that whole 6 hours, you can undo everything that you did during that fasting time. So if you need help with this, I do have a carb quiz that you can take, and it's at fasttoheal.info/carb quiz. That will help you identify where you should be starting as at a level of carbohydrates. So I suggest anywhere from 25 grams to 100 grams for most people. Most people who are very ill and have a lot of insulin resistance, you are going to be more like in the 50 and under range. People who are more insulin sensitive and are, not looking to lose weight or reverse disease, they can be closer to that 100 grams per day range. That's where I fall. But it really depends on your goals, your past history, and what you're trying to accomplish. But keeping carbohydrates low and choosing non-starchy, high fiber carbohydrates can be your best bet when it comes to ingesting carbohydrates. And of course, eating them, if they are starchy or sugary or processed, eating them at the end of your meal after a protein or fat or fiber, so that you don't have as big of an insulin response. So that would be the fifth thing. The sixth thing we've already alluded to, keeping that stress managed, keeping the cortisol down. Cortisol in and of itself is not bad. We need cortisol is an awesome hormone. It helps us deal with stress, and it helps us to feel good. It's when cortisol levels are chronically high that we get in trouble. So when we're stressed all the time, when we don't get enough sleep, that drives our cortisol up, and stress. So chronic stress. So those two things you really have to prioritize getting in check in order to make sure you're insulin sensitive from day to day. So managing stress is super important. I don't have an easy answer for everybody, because everybody's life is a little bit different. But it may come down to you removing, if you have a chronic stress that's getting in the way of you getting well, you may need to remove that stressor at least for a time in order to get healthy and well. But high cortisol levels from day to day creates insulin resistance, because it causes your body to release more glucose. That glucose just kind of hangs out in the bloodstream, and then you need to release insulin in order to deal with that glucose. So again, vicious cycle. So sleep and stress are critical to manage insulin resistance and become more insulin sensitive. And then the last thing that can help you become more insulin sensitive is fiber. And I don't talk a ton about this on the podcast because, we do follow a low carb overall approach here, but It's the low starch, high fiber vegetables that I like my students to focus on. So, those above ground vegetables that have a good amount of fiber. Because again, fiber is going to help blunt an insulin response when you do eat carbohydrates. And high fiber vegetables that are non starchy, those help you to increase when you consume high fiber foods. That helps you, the microbes in your gut will help to increase your level of butyrate, a compound called butyrate. Maybe you've heard of that, and it's essential for good microbiome balance and good health of the digestive tract and your large intestine overall. So, eating higher fiber vegetables and fruits too. It doesn't have to be vegetables, but eating your fruit with a meal so you don't get a big insulin response, but that will help to increase the level of these microbes that help to produce butyrate, and that will just help with overall gut health and reduce your level of insulin resistance. So all of these things together can help you to decrease inflammation and help you to stay more insulin sensitive.